Hello and welcome to the CB&Q in Wyoming. I'm Mark Pruitt, Chief Engineer, Owner, Builder, Financier, Brass Hat, and pretty much everything else related to the model railroad, except of course for the absolute veto power of my wife. Today we're starting a new series on the CB&Q in Wyoming YouTube channel called Building Casper. Forgive me if I look down, I have some notes here that I have to refer to get through this. So what's this series all about? Well, it's about how I developed and am building Casper Yard on my model railroad. We're going to go in some detail through the development of the yard, the addition of elements, which ones I picked, which ones I left out from the prototype, and the track planning, construction, and finally the operation of the yard, how it fits in with the overall layout, how it complements the layout, how it supports the entire layout without actually overpowering the layout. Let's talk for a minute about how the series is going to be presented. First of all, the schedule is going to be irregular. When I get an episode written and produced, then I'll post it. Could be 1 week, it could be 4 weeks between episodes, maybe even longer. And how long will this series last? Well, it will last until the yard is complete. Very little of the scenery is complete, very few of the structures are ready to go. So we'll go through until that's almost completely finished or until everybody stops watching. So what about the series content? What is it actually going to cover? Well, it's going to cover my approach to the Casper Yard, including operating concepts, operating goals, the difference between those, elements that I decided I wanted to have in the yard, elements I had to leave out of the yard, and so on. We'll also cover, of course, the planning in great detail. How did I wind up with the track arrangement that I had in Casper? How does that track arrangement support the concepts for operation? And how does it support the rest of the railroad? I'll talk in depth about the construction of the yard. That includes everything from bench work to sub-road bed, to scenery and wiring and track work, and of course the many structures located in the yard. And finally, we'll talk about operation. How well should the yard support the rest of the layout? What does the rest of the layout need for the yard to be able to do? Is it a background element? Is it the focus of the entire layout? Or is it somewhere in between? We'll go through all of that in some detail. Now the topics are going to be focused, but they'll also be sprinkled throughout all of the other topics as necessary to make the discussion make sense. So today's episode, the first episode, is all about my approach to Casper Yard. Let's get started. I guess I need to explain what an approach is. Isn't it just another name for planning? Yes, it could be, but that would get confusing since when we talk about planning, mostly we're talking about track planning. There's a good amount of non-track type planning involved in the approach phase, planning out operating ideas, industries in the yard, and that sort of thing. You'll get a better feel for what the approach really is as we go. These were the steps I went through. They are, in no particular order: A. Considering the real Casper, or in other words, research. B. Development of operating goals. C. Generating a list of features to include, both railroad and non-railroad related. D. How much space to allocate for Casper in the layout. And E. Working out the operational concepts. Developing these steps is an iterative process with each step impacting all the others. For example, operating goals for the yard will significantly impact the features included and, in turn, the space required for the yard, and all of these will all have an impact on the operational concept. But to make some sense of it, we'll run through each step one at a time. The first item, considering the real Casper. Well, what does that mean? Well, there are a lot of facets to this. It means, for one thing, doing research. I model an era before I was born, so for period elements, like the engine facilities and the icing platform, I have to try to find photos and/or descriptions. This can be very frustrating. For example, after many hours of searching, I have yet to find a single photo of the Casper icing facility. We'll talk about that more in a minute. I didn't do all the research before I planned the layout. If I had, I still wouldn't have a plan for the yard, let alone for the rest of the layout. Research is ongoing, and sometimes I learn something that means that what I've already done is incorrect, like the roundhouse. About a year ago, I learned that the Burlington's Casper roundhouse was wooden. I had already built and placed the Walther's brick roundhouse, so will I go back and replace the brick one with something more accurate? Well, no time soon. Fixing those sorts of things are for later, when the layout is basically finished and operating, which at this point in my life probably really means never. But I'm okay with that. Casper had a roundhouse. The model yard has a roundhouse. Good enough for now. Another facet of considering the real Casper is how faithful to the prototype do I want to be. I could get so nitpicky that I scratch build everything and never get anywhere close to an operational scenic layout. Heck, I could get so down in the weeds that I never even finish Casper Yard. The roundhouse I talked about is a good indication of my modeling philosophy on this point. For me, faithful to the prototype means modeling, in the space I have available, certain industries and elements of the yard I knew to be there, like the Standard Oil Company's refinery tank car loading racks, and the reefer icing facility that was located in Casper. If I have photos, or can find them with a reasonable amount of searching, I'll try to create a model that has that same look. If not, I'll do the best I can based on other sources. Take the icing platform, for example. As I said earlier, I can't find a single photo of Casper's facility, but I do have examples of other Burlington icing facilities, so I'm using common elements of those to help determine how Casper's might have looked. The platforms have no roof in the pictures I have of several different locations, so Casper's model will have no roof. It's kind of like how locomotives have a family look that differs from railroad to railroad. And yet another facet is fidelity to the prototype track arrangement. In my case, other than the engine facilities and tank car loading racks being on the geographically correct end of the yard, the west end, requirements for a functional model yard took absolute precedence over the prototype track arrangement, and I made no effort to try to match the real thing. On to developing operating goals. What does that entail? What are operating goals anyway? Well, operating goals is all about how I see the role of the yard during operating sessions. Operating goals define what I want the yard to be. Will it be a focal point of the layout or a background element? Will it require dedicated operators or is it just a big scenic element? Operating goals help us figure this out. My overarching operating goal for Casper is that it be a hotbed of activity with the potential of being a major bottleneck on the layout if not run efficiently. I plan for at least 2 operators, the yard operator and an engine hostler. Ideally, it may take 3, 1 operator running the yard proper, 1 switching the industries and assisting the main yard operator, and 1 more to hostle locomotives. Why? On the prototype, Casper is the main yard on the division, and so it is on my layout. I developed my yard operating goals as I considered and planned the yard and layout. Remember, this whole thing isn't a linear process, it's an iterative one. To meet these goals, I developed the following rules and elements. Nearly all trains go through Casper. The only exception is trains bound to and from Cody from the north. And since I modeled the steam era, all those trains get a motive power change, even if they're through freights that with today's motive power wouldn't even stop. Number 2, except for through trains or trains from Cody, all trains originate and or terminate in Casper. That means a lot of trains being made up and broken down. Number 3, 2 Casper industries are large. enough to realistically supply and consume an entire mainline train worth of cars. Those are the icing facility at a capacity of 24 reefers and Standard Oil with loading racks likewise handling 22 to 24 tank cars at a time. Reefers came into Casper, were iced, and went right back out on a tight schedule. Tank cars came in, were loaded, then sorted into different trains based on destination. Now in reality, those tank cars were on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, while the reefers were on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, but modeler's license, driven by space constraints, meant I combined the two railroads into one physical plant dominated by the Burlington in the Casper model. Number 4. Other industrial switching will have to be done in Casper to support the smaller industries and to shuttle ice from the main ice house, which was away from the platform, to the smaller ice house that fed the platform. This last was not very common on railroads, but it is accurate for Casper. Number 5. Switchers can handle cuts of cars that are limited to the number of drivers on the locomotive. So an 060 can handle 6 cars, an 080 8 cars. 8 cars plus the switcher is also the length of the drill track. This means a switcher can't just grab an entire train and sort it in the yard all at once. It has to be done in several cuts. This adds a bit more spice to the chores of the yard crew. How did I arrive at this rule? Seems sort of arbitrary, doesn't it? To a large degree, it is. But it's simple. Number of drivers equal number of cars that can be handled, and I think it will make Casper Yard ops more interesting. If it's too difficult to get everything done, the number of cars for the switchers can be adjusted, or the rule can even be scrapped. The next step is listing features to include, and, by implication, deciding what to exclude. This seems pretty easy, doesn't it? Just make a list, mentally or in writing, of all the things to include in the yard. But maybe it's not so easy. Almost all of us would like to include things on our model railroads that just don't fit in the space we have available, so we have to pick and choose what to include and what to leave out. Some features are easy to eliminate because we're not particularly interested in them, like a rib track in my case, or because it doesn't add much operational potential to the layout, like a second team track. But other features are harder to eliminate because we really want to include them, but to do so might mean eliminating something else we also really want to include. An example for me is the Center Street Underpass. I remember this underpass from when I was a very young boy, and I really wanted to include it in the layout. But to do so meant unacceptably reducing another feature, the Standard Oil refinery loading racks. I could have gone with a 10-car loading rack rather than a 22 to 24-car rack, but that would have seriously impacted the operational aspect of the rack and to some extent the entire layout. So I very reluctantly let the underpass go. To be honest though, I'm still looking for a way to fit it in. And that's it for listing features. The discussion of this step was short, but the importance of carefully thinking through and selecting all the possible features you might include should not be underestimated. Now let's talk about determining how much space to allocate for Casper Yard. This was dependent on many factors I didn't list as steps in my approach to Casper Yard, including, most importantly, total layout space available. It also, of course, was dependent on the role of the yard in the operation of the layout as a whole. I wanted to balance the yard's size and complexity against the overall layout. I didn't want it to overpower the layout and have Casper become the sole focus of operations, but at the same time the yard is the center point and most operationally complex part of the layout. So how did I balance all this out? To be honest, I won't know if I did it successfully until the layout is operational, but I think I have. What I did was look at the conceptual operations on the layout as a whole. In a nutshell, I have these major train move types. We have westbound through trains coming in from east staging to Orrin Junction, running through Casper on their way to west staging beyond Franny. They may drop or pick up cuts of cars in Casper, but nowhere else. Then, of course, we have their opposite direction counterparts, eastbound through trains that come in from west staging to Franny, running through Casper on their way to east staging beyond Orange Junction. And like westbound trains, they may drop or pick up cuts of cars in Casper, but nowhere else. There will be one or two lander-bound Chicago and Northwestern trains coming in from east staging to Orange Junction, running to Casper and then beyond, terminating somewhere on the lander branch. Like the through train, the reverse is also true. Trains originating on the lander branch run to Casper and then continue eastbound, terminating in staging beyond Orange Junction. We have trains bound for Cody from west staging entering at Franny, possibly picking up cars there that are bound for Cody branch line destinations, and then proceeding on down the branch. Once again, we have the reverse moves. Trains from Cody proceeding to Franny, dropping off cars there as needed, and heading on into west staging. And there are the local trains servicing towns along the division. These will almost all originate in Casper. The last of the freight train movements, seasonal and special trains as needed, like stock trains from Powder River to points east, the apple harvest from Lander to points east, and the sugar beet harvest trains from Powell on the Cody branch to the Holly Sugar Plant in Worland. These special trains may not always originate in Casper. An extra locomotive and caboose may be deadheaded in a train from Casper to the originating town for use on the special train within one or two subsequent operating sessions. And we finally come to passenger trains. These will be included along the lines which either originate in Casper or the connections to the outside world from west staging to Cody, and all passenger trains from east and west that pass through Casper. So clearly Casper will be a busy place and needs enough space to be able to handle the traffic it will see. That meant I needed to design an operationally complete classification yard, more than just a passing siding and a couple of short classification tracks. I'll talk about how I planned that part out when we get into the track planning episode. Here's a hint, it's part analysis and part best guess. Wanting to include an engine facility also dictates space needs for the yard, and the list of major train moves with its implied large number of locomotives through Casper, combined with the operating goal of switching out power on almost every train, requires either a locomotive staging area or a modeled facility capable of convincingly supporting all that motive power. A 3-stall roundhouse and just a coaling tower isn't going to cut it. I could have gone with the staging area approach and saved a lot of space, but I wanted a modeled engine terminal. And finally, the industries require a certain amount of space. Fortunately, the two large industries are linear in nature, so they require length but not a lot of width, at least not for the modeled parts. The standard refinery took up a gigantic area on the west end of Casper, but as I'm only including the loading racks and none of the other rail spurs that serviced the refinery, I only need a space 6 feet long and less than 6 inches wide. The refinery will be represented as mostly in the aisleway and on the backdrop. Likewise, the icing platform, while an integral part of Casper operations, also is long but narrow. The platform and tracks are 6 feet long, but again, only 6 inches wide. The ice houses are along tracks which also support other industries. While proceeding with planning, I was able to fit everything I think I need in Casper in about 80 square feet. With a total layout floor space of about 800 square feet, the yard came out to about 10% of layout floor space. 10% shouldn't visually overpower the rest of the layout, so that seemed reasonable. But that was just a seat-of-the-pants assessment. Positioning of the yard in the room also is at least as big a factor in the visual impact that it has as total floor space. In the final layout plan, Casper is tucked into the far corner of the room away from the entrance and visually hidden by two peninsulas, so it certainly won't visually dominate the entire layout. And by the way, it also has very ample aisle space, so operators can freely move past each other as they work their jobs in Casper. And finally we come to working out the operational concepts. Most of this topic I actually snuck in earlier as I was working on all the other steps, especially developing operating goals. Remember when I went through that list of rules when talking about developing operating goals? The one that says nearly all trains go through Casper, how many cars different switchers can handle, and so on? Those are the biggest part of the operational concepts for Casper. They were developed to support the operational goals and vice versa. The available space for the classification of cars and receiving and dispatching trains from Casper also drives some of the operational concepts. I had room to include only one arrival and departure track, which means the yard operator will be sweating at times to clear that track in a timely manner in order to build up the next train out or to receive the next train due in. Fortunately, since almost all trains will stop to change motive power, the main line can often be utilized as a second arrival and departure track, albeit with some constraints. I'll talk about those constraints in more detail in the planning episode. The list of features drives operating concepts in various ways. One example of this is the icing platform. In the real world, Casper was a stopping point for icing of reefers. Whole trains would come into Casper, get iced, then head back out in the same direction. These trains received priority handling by the yard. So on the model, the yard operator will have to suspend other work while he moves these cars to the icing platform, then suspend work again when the cars are iced and ready to go. But the icing platform also was a case of the operating concept, handling reefers in a priority fashion in Casper, driving me to include the icing facility in the list of features. The challenge of that was just too good to pass up. As I hope you figured out from all this, working through all the elements of the approach to Casper Yard was a bit like the dog wagging the tail, wagging the dog. A decision at one point drives a decision at another point, which drives a modification to the original decision because the second decision can't be accommodated fully, so an adjustment to the first decision is needed. Or a third decision was impacted, even though it often turned out that at first glance, the third decision appeared to be completely unrelated to the others. Phew! That's probably way more than too much for one episode, so let's wrap up for now. In this conclusion, the first point I want to make is that you don't have to go through all of these steps to develop a satisfying layout or part of a layout. You will probably do this to some extent as you work out your track plan, but you may not be aware you're even doing it. I did it in a fairly rigorous fashion over time because I model specific prototypes at specific locations and I wanted to create specific types of problems and challenges for the operators. I also wanted those operations to be as prototypical as I could make them. The second point here is that I enjoy this whole process. I like doing the research and I like figuring out how to incorporate it into my operating concepts and how to fit it into the space available. If you don't enjoy research, don't do it. Do the things you enjoy. Maybe you're a prototype modeler who is satisfied with running rolling stock that's fairly representative of the railroad you model, but don't care so much about fidelity to the locations the railroad ran through. Or maybe you're a freelancer who wants to represent the industries you model and the traffic they generate in a prototypical way on your fictional railroad. In other words, this is just how I do it. You should do it, or not do it, your way. I hope this was interesting and maybe even entertaining. At the very least, you have some idea of just what goes through this particular train nut's mind. In the next episode, the planning episode, I'll talk about how I planned arrangement of the yard around the different elements we've gone through here today. It may be 3 or 4 weeks, or I may get a wild hair and get it out sooner. Whatever the time span, I hope you'll join me. And I promise, by episode 3, we'll get into actual construction of the yard. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time.